Let's imagine you just got sent back to the Earth 420 million years ago. You probably think you'd be surrounded by things like dinosaurs, or maybe some disturbing looking prehistoric sharks. But what you'd actually see is a giant mushroom. Rising out of the dirt like smooth, grey obelisks are these massive, towering pillars. They stand 20, 25, even 30 feet tall. They are wider than a human man, and they dominate not just the skyline, but the entire Earth. There are no birds chirping, no insects buzzing in your ear. There isn't even the sound of wind rustling through leaves, because there are no leaves. But here's the problem. Trees didn't exist yet. Wood hasn't been invented by evolution. These pillars have no bark, no needles, and no seeds. They are the only tall things on the entire face of the Earth, and they have absolutely no right to be there. It feels wrong.
Giant fungus ran the world.
So if these weren't trees, what on literal Earth were they? When we find fossils of things that are 20 feet tall and shaped like trunks, we usually call them trees. It's the safe bet. It's the logical conclusion. And that is exactly what the scientific community did when these fossils were first discovered in Canada in 1859. The man who found them was named John William Dawson, and he took one look at these massive logs and classified them as a type of Comphia, which is an ancient primitive pine tree. He named the organism Prototexides, which basically translates to first yew. It made sense at the time. If it's big and vertical, it has to be a plant. The problem was that as soon as people started looking inside the fossils, the tree theory started to fall apart. When you cut a tree open, you see rings. You see xylem and phloem, which are complex plumbing systems designed to move water against the pull of gravity. But when researchers looked inside Prototexides, they didn't see wood cells. They just saw a bunch of tubes. For the next 150 years, Prototexides became the biggest identity crisis in the history of paleontology. Since tree didn't fit, scientists started guessing. One group argued it was a gargantuan lichen, a symbolic marriage between fungi and algae. Another group insisted it was a massive rolling mat of liverworts that had somehow been rolled up and fossilized in a vertical position, which, let's be honest, sounds like a desperate attempt to avoid the weirdest possibility of all. The scientific community refused to believe that something this large could ever be anything other than a plant. It was an atomical impossibility. Plants have solar panels, leaves to fuel their growth. Mushrooms and fungi, on the other hand, are supposed to be small, squishy, and hidden under a damp log. But as the evidence mounted, the plant theory didn't just seem wrong, it seemed impossible. So if it wasn't a tree, and it wasn't a plant, and it wasn't a rolled up moss rug, what was the only thing left? Well, in 2007, we finally got a definitive answer, and it was one of the many things scientists have been dreading because of how much it complicated our understanding of ancient Earth. Through chemical analysis of carbon isotopes trapped within the fossils, researchers were able to confirm that Prototexides was not photosynthesizing. It wasn't eating sunlight. It was consuming matter, organic matter. And this confirmed the identity once and for all. It was a gargantuan fungus, a mega mushroom. No, not that. That. Specifically, it was what we call a fungal fruiting body. When you see a mushroom in your backyard, you're only looking at a tiny fraction of the organism, the reproductive part. The real body is the mycelium, a massive network of thread-like roots underground. Prototexides was essentially a 26-foot tall mushroom, but it didn't look like a mushroom you'd put on pizza. It didn't have a cap or gills. Instead, it was more like a solid pillar of mycelium. Remember those microscopic tubes the researchers found? Those were hyphae, the exact same building blocks that make up a common button mushroom today. Usually, when you step on a mushroom, it smashes. It's mostly water and air. But Prototexides was built different. Evolution had forced this fungus to weave its hyphae into such a tight, dense mesh that it would become as hard as any wood we see today. It had to be. If it wasn't, the first strong gust of wind would have snapped it like a dry twig. But here is the biological impossible factor. Growth takes energy, a lot of it, and modern mushrooms stay small because their food source is limited. They eat decaying leaves and dead stuff, which aren't always the most nutritious things in the world, and they only pop up when the conditions are perfect because the energy cost of being tall is so high. So how could a fungus, which usually hides in the dark, find enough energy to be this big? Well, you'll understand how these pillars grew so massive when you realise they grew in the Devonian period. This time period was... well, it was basically the Wild West for biology. Nothing made sense and you could essentially make any biological build you wanted. And as long as it sorta made sense, voila, you could exist. Back then, the rules of the planet were flipped. Today, if you're a giant organism made of delicious, nutrient-rich protein, which fungi are, you get eaten. Animals, from slugs to deer, would descend on you instantly. But 400 million years ago, there were no large herbivores. The biggest thing walking on land was likely an ancient relative of a millipede, barely a few inches long. There were no cows, no deer, not even a squirrel to take a nibble. Prototexides had no predators. It was essentially allowed to grow as much as it wanted without anyone ever trying to take a bite. So if anyone was wondering, no, these giant shrooms wouldn't actually be able to take you down. They were still just mushrooms. Maybe if one fell on you and crushed you, but they aren't predators or have any sort of real offense by any means. But they had another unfair advantage at the time. They were eating the floor. During the Devonian, the Earth was covered in something called cryptogamic crusts. Imagine a thick, wet carpet made of moss, bacteria, and primitive algae covering almost every square inch of the planet's surface. Because there were no complex decomposers yet, no worms, no sophisticated bacteria, this matter just sat there. It accumulated. It was a giant, uneaten salad that spanned entire continents. Prototexides was built to exist as the world's largest waste management system. It used its massive underground network to absorb these massive mats of moss and bacteria, recycling them into fungal biomass. It had zero competition for food. It was like living in an infinite buffet, except the menu was just organic matter. But at least you are the only one inside the buffet. I didn't think these mushrooms had evolved that far to really care much about their taste buds. This floor-eating strategy provided the insane amount of fuel required to build 26-foot spires. While the plants around them were struggling to evolve leaves and suck carbon from the air, the giant mushrooms were just drinking the landscape itself. But even with infinite food, standing up is a choice. Evolution doesn't do things for prestige. There is a massive energy cost to building a vertical pillar. Why stand up? What is the actual advantage of being 20 feet tall in a world where nothing is tall enough to compete with you? Well, the reason Prototexides stood so tall isn't about being better than other plants. It's about his children, specifically his spores. If you are a fungus, your goal in life is to get your spores as far away from your parent body as possible. This is how you colonize new lands and find new salads to eat. But the problem is physics. In a world of low-lying plants that only grow a few inches off the ground, the air right at the surface is stagnant. It's slow. If you release your spores at ground level, they just fall. They land right next to you and everyone competes for the same patch of moss. Now your children just ate your food. But by growing 26 feet tall, Prototexides had discovered an aerial superpower. Think of it like a gravity advantage. When you are the tallest thing on the planet, the wind is different up there. It's faster, it's more consistent. By releasing millions of spores from the top of its pillar, Prototexides ensured that its offspring could catch a breeze and travel for miles, potentially even crossing vast expanses of the ancient Earth that plants couldn't reach yet. Height was allowing them to disperse their babies everywhere. They were blasting their spores all over the planet. Because they were the only ones using this strategy, they were aggressive colonizers. Everywhere the wind blew, the fungal pillars followed. They were the undisputed kings for 50 million years, which is a lot longer than many other animals. Even dinosaurs like the T-Rex got to reign. They had the food, they had the height, and they had the range. So what finally managed to kill a giant that has no predators, infinite food, and total dominance of the wind? The downfall of the fungal empire didn't actually happen because something started eating them. They got outcompeted by their worst mortal enemy, real trees. For 50 million years, plants had been the underdogs. They were small, squishy, and tethered to the ground. But evolution was tinkering. Plants were slowly developing a new chemical superpower called lignin. Lignin is the organic polymer that creates wood. It is effectively biological armor. Before lignin, if a plant tried to grow tall, its own water pressure would make it collapse. But with lignin, plants could build rigid, high-pressure pipes. They could build trunks. Enter Archaeopteris, the first true tree. Suddenly, for the first time in history, the fungal spires weren't the only tall things on the horizon. These new trees started racing towards the sun. But this wasn't just about light. As these trees got taller, they developed something even more dangerous: leaves. Wide, flat leaves were the ultimate solar panels. They were far more efficient at gathering energy than the fungal scavenging strategy. These trees began to create shadows, and in these shadows, the cryptogamic crusts, the moss mats that the fungal pillars ate, started to wither and die. The Green Revolution was literally stealing the sun away from the fungus's food source. It was a wild time back then, when organisms that couldn't even understand they were organisms were battling each other without even touching each other, and instead just growing into giant sticks. What a competition. But trees didn't just shade the mushrooms out, they did something far more permanent. They fundamentally changed the chemistry of the Earth's surface. The true death sentence for the giant pillars wasn't the trees themselves, but what the trees brought with them: roots. Before the rise of wood, the Earth didn't really have soil as we know it today. It had regolith, crushed rock, sand, and some slime. But the first trees were aggressive. They didn't just sit on the surface like moss, they shoved their roots deep into the bedrock. They broke the stone apart, grinding it into a fine, nutrient-rich powder. This created deep soil for the first time in history, and while you might think more soil would be good for a fungus, it was actually the opposite. With deep soil came a new cast of characters: tiny insects, worms, and most importantly, smaller, more efficient decomposers. Because the soil was now packed with nutrients and oxygen, it allowed a massive surge of subterranean life. Instead of one giant mushroom tower eating everything, there were now billions of tiny, microscopic fungi and bacteria living underground, doing the same job but doing it faster and with much less energy. The world became too complex for giant mushrooms to survive. They were too slow to adapt. Their fuel source was being colonized by smaller, faster things. The vast moss salads of the ancient world were being replaced with complex forests and deep soil, and by the end of the Devonian, the Prototexides spires were gone. But don't feel bad. Giant vertical mushrooms were never meant to be, but instead, something better was. Giant horizontal mushrooms. If you travel to the Blue Mountains of Oregon today, you'll find an organism called Armoralia osteri,
better known as the humongous fungus.
On the surface, it looks like a bunch of normal, small mushrooms, but underground, it is a single continuous organism covering nearly 4 square miles. It weighs an estimated 35,000 tons. It is, quite literally, larger than any Prototexides could ever dream of being. Fungi moved into the Shadow Empire. Instead of being the pillars of the forest, they became the internet of the forest. They developed what we now call the mycorrhizal network. They stopped trying to outclimb the trees and instead decided to make the trees their employees. Today, almost every tree on Earth is connected to a fungal network. The fungi provides minerals and communication between trees, and in exchange, the trees feed the fungi sugar from their leaves. It is a much more efficient, stable strategy than standing alone in an open field. The giant pillars didn't die out because they weren't strong enough. They died because the world grew up around them, and the most overpowered strategy was no longer standing tall, but being everywhere at once. But this leaves us with a lingering question. If conditions shifted back, if the forests were to disappear, could the pillars ever return? In a world where humans are rapidly changing the climate and clearing forests, are we inadvertently resetting the clock for Prototexides 2.0? Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the answer is probably no. The era of fungal pillars was a kind of one-time only thing in the process of evolution. It happened because there was a very specific window where there was no large animals and no tall trees. Today, the atmosphere changed. The oxygen levels are different, the competition is too fierce, and the decomposers in our soil are far too efficient to let a single organism hoard that much organic matter ever again. If a mushroom tried to grow 20 feet tall today, it would be colonized by other, smaller mushrooms before it even reached your height still. It would be eaten from the inside out, way before any of the other real predators would also go after it too. The Age of Pillars was a unique, surreal chapter in Earth's history. A 50 million year experiment in what happens when life is given unlimited space and zero rules. It is pretty cool to realize that for a huge portion of our planet's history, the most powerful thing on land wasn't a dinosaur, or a mammal, or even a plant, but just a mushroom. Obviously, powerful depends on how you look at it, but honestly, I'm pretty cool with the trees of today. Who knew they were responsible for putting an entire species to extinction, a species of giant shrooms? Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, check out our last video here about the ancient insects of the past. And they actually ate stuff. Unlike these shrooms, they were actually deadly.